On the bottom of Daf Gimel Amid Beis, we're dealing with the mitzvah of Aliyah L'Regel, and we'll start about 10 lines up from the bottom. It says, Medaber v'eno shomea, shomea v'eno medaber chayav. So we have two categories here of individuals that are obligated in the mitzvah of Re'iyah L'Regel, despite their handicap. One is a deaf person who's capable of speech, and the other is someone who has the ability to hear, but he cannot speak. So the first one is deaf, and the second one is mute, but both of them have das, and therefore they're obligated in the mitzvah of Aliyah L'Regel. So the Gemara immediately asks a kasha from a brisa on the Mishnah. Vasanya, we have a brisa that says, Medaber v'eno shomea, shomea v'eno medaber potur. That if he's lacking one of two things, either the ability to hear or the ability to speak, then he's exempt from the mitzvah of Aliyah L'Regel. So how do we reconcile the brisa and the Mishnah? Amar Avina v'itema Rava. We're going to assume, like the brisa, that a medaber v'eno shomea, shomea v'eno medaber are exempt from the mitzvah of Aliyah L'Regel, even though they have das. And the Gemara on Daf Gimel is going to explain why. How do we reconcile that with our Mishnah? And the answer is Chisurei Mechsera. We're going to have to read an additional line into the Mishnah. Because the Mishnah seems to say you're only part if you're lacking both the ability to hear and the ability to speak. That's called a deaf mute. But the Mishnah is talking about a different obligation completely. Not the obligation of Aliyah L'Regel, but the obligation of Simcha B'Regel. Here's the way we're going to read the Mishnah. Hakol chayovim b're'iyah u'b'simcha chutz micheresh ha'medaber v'eino shomea or shomea v'eino medaber shepotem min ha're'iyah v'afal pi shepotem min ha're'iyah chayav b'simcha. This means that Simcha is a classic mitzvah, like all mitzvahs, and all we need as a precondition for the obligation is that he's a ben das. And if he could either hear or speak, one of the two, then we assume he's a ben das. And Simcha, therefore, like any other mitzvah, he's obligated in. But there's a unique halacha with regard to Re'iyah, the mitzvah of Aliyah L'Regel, which we're going to derive from Psukim very shortly, that if he's lacking either the koach hashmiya or the koach hadibur, he's parted from Re'iyah. If he's lacking in both hearing and speaking, he's a deaf mute. Shota is somebody who manifests certain strange behavior patterns. The katan, or if he's less than bar mitzvah, potter af min hasimcha. And that's just an expression of the universal rule that if you don't have das, a lav bar das is potter from all the mitzvahs. To be called mitzvah samuras b'torah. So when it says cheresh together with shota or katan, we have to understand that that's a cheresh who's not a bardas. And why isn't he a bardas? Because he doesn't hear and he doesn't speak. And even with regard to the mitzvah of simcha, we're going to exclude someone who is not a bardas. He's lacking both speech and hearing. But that's not a discussion about olas re'iyah. As far as re'iyah is concerned, with regard to the mitzvah of Aliyah L'Regel to bring your karbanos of re'iyah, that's already a different story. There, the standards are upgraded. We need more than just that he's a bardas. It's not enough to establish that he's a bardas. There's going to be a tour of either Eino Shomea or Eino Medaber, as we saw it in the Bryce. Tanya Nami Yochi, Hakol chayov b're'iyu b'simcha, chutz micheresh hamidaber v'yeino shomea, shomea v'yeino midaber, sheptur bin ha're'iya. V'af al pi shepoter bin ha're'iya, and here we start Daf Gimel, chayav b'simcha, because as far as the Chiyuv Simcha is concerned, all we need is a bardas. If he's lacking in both the ability to speak and as well the ability to hear, he's a shotel, he's a katan, he's potmina simcha, and he's potmikol mitzvahs, and that's because he's not a bardas. So now the Gemara asks the obvious question: why is it that even a bardas who has the ability to hear or has the ability to speak is exempt from re'iyah? And why is it that simcha, those special karbonos shlomim that you bring on Yontif, mechayvet? And the Gemara answers, le'inyan re'iyah, gama re'iyah mihakel. We're going to derive the laws of re'iyah from the mitzvah of hakel, which means once every 7 years after the Shemitah, when people come on Aliyah L'Regel for Sukkot, at the beginning of the 8th year of the Shemitah cycle, the Melech is going to read in front of the entire tzibur of Klal Yisrael Sefer Mishnah Torah. And now we have a Gzeira Shavah between Hakel and Re'iyah, and Aliyah L'Regel. Dichsiv, in the mitzvah of Hakel, Parshas Vayelech, at the end of Sefer Dvarim, Perek Lamed Aleph, it says, Hakel Sa'am Hanoshim Hanoshim Ataf. We gather together men, women, and children. Uksiv, Bevo Kol Yisrael Le'roz Es Pnei Hashem Elokecha. So in the very next pasuk, the Torah commands us in the mitzvah of Re'iyah. And in Shmos Perek Chav Gimel, Parshas Kitis, we say, Sholosh Pamim Bashana, Meira Kol Zechurcha. So we see the word Re'iyah appears in both the context of Hakel and in the context of the mitzvah of Aliyah L'Regel. And that allows us to create a Gzeira Shavah between the two. Now, in the case of Hakel, clearly, one who cannot hear is not obligated in the mitzvah of Hakel, because the Torah requires that the Melech read the Parshios B'Ozneim into their ears. And we're going to see that even if he can hear but he cannot speak, he's exempt from the mitzvah of Hakel. And therefore, ipso facto, he's exempt from the mitzvah of Re'iyah because of this Gzeira Shavah. So now let's study the mitzvah of Hakel. How do we know that if he hears but he doesn't speak, or he speaks and he doesn't hear, he's exempt from Hakel? Tichsiv, in the parasha of Hakel, it says, Laman Yishmu Ulaman Yilmedu. The Tanya, we learned in the Brayso, Laman Yishmu Prat L'Medaber V'Yeino Shomea. This comes to exclude someone who cannot hear. He's deaf, and despite the fact that he can speak and he's a bardas, he's excluded from the obligation of Hakel because of Laman Yishmu. What does Laman Yilmedu teach me? Prat L'Shomea V'Yeino Medaber. That someone who can speak, he's considered Yilmedu. He can learn and teach and transmit the tradition that he learned because he has the power of speech. But if he's Eino Medaber, even though he's a bardas, he can understand what you're saying, nevertheless he's excluded from Laman Yilmedu. So both a Medaber Ve'eino Shomea and a Shomea Ve'eino Medaber both are excluded by these two phrases from the mitzvah of Hakel, whether it's Laman Yishmu or Laman Yilmedu. Then we have a Gzeira Shava of Re'iyah to tell us that even as far as Re'iyah L'Regel is concerned, that those two categories of individuals, to the same extent that they are exempt from Hakil or exempt from Re'iyah. So the Gemara asks, L'meimra D'chilo Mishtai Lo Gomar, are you telling me that just because he can't speak, he's excluded under the pasuk Laman Yilmidu Vahanu Trei Ilmi? There was a story with two mute people that weren't able to speak. The Havi Bishvivusa, the Rebbe, they lived in the area, they were neighbors of Rebbe. Bnei Barte, the Rebbe Yochanan ben Gudgada, and these were the grandsons through the daughter of Rabbi Yochanan, obviously according to different tradition, Bnei Achase, they were nephews of Rabbi Yochanan. Whenever Rebbe went up to the Beis Medrash, Havi Aili v'Yasve, they would go up and they would sit in front of Rebbe, Umenaidi Bereishayu, and they would shake their heads, Umerachshin Svasayu, they would make lip, they would speak with their lips, Uboy Rebbe Rachme Alayu, and Rebbe prayed on behalf of them that they should become healthy, Vitasu, and they became healthy. They began to speak. Vishtakach Tavi Gmiri, and when they could speak, we discovered that they knew Hilchasa, Sifra, Sifri, Vakula Shas. They were experts in all of the Mishnayos, all of the Braisos, and all Sifri, plus all of Shas. So we see that even someone who's Shomer Veina Medaber, even though he doesn't speak, he can certainly study. So the Gemara is now not assuming that the Torah is requiring that he could transmit the Torah. Omar of Mar Sutra, Karibe Laman Yalamdu, Laman Yalamedu, that we read the pasuk as if it said that they have to be able to teach. And clearly someone who's mute could not transmit the Torah to others. He cannot be Malamid Lacherin. And therefore he's excluded from the mitzvah of Hakel under the pasuk Laman Yalamedu. And this is what we see from our Zutra. And it sounds like Mar Zutra derived his conclusion from the story of the two mutes who studied under Rebbe and then became healthy. They were able to speak. And based on that whole story, he came to the conclusion, Rav Mar Zutra, that we have to read the pasuk Laman Yalamedu. The Gemara adds, Rav Ashi Omar, even without the story about the two mutes, Vadai Laman Yalamedu, we certainly have to read the pasuk as if it said Laman Yalamedu, that they would teach. The Isal Kedait Laman Yilmedu, it means that they would learn and study. V'kevan lo mishtai lo gomar, and you can tell me that since they cannot speak, they cannot learn. Is then v'kevan lo shama lo gomar. Then what about the person who can't hear? Certainly he's not able to learn if he can't hear anything. And yet we excluded a person who cannot hear, who's deaf, from the pasuk Laman Yishmu, not from the pasuk Laman Yilmedu. Hi, this person who cannot speak, but he can hear, Milaman Yishmu Nafka. What does that mean? Hi, Zeh Shomer Ve'einu Medaber. If he can hear, but he cannot speak, Milaman Yishmu Nafka. Why? Shari Kvar Lamadu Misham Shemisha Einu Yochel Lilmod Patu. And therefore, Madua Hutzcha Torah Latzo Lamait Milaman Yilmidu. So already from the pasuk Laman Yishma'u, we could already derive that the case of someone who cannot hear, no, I'm sorry, the case of someone who could hear but cannot speak, Laman Yishmu, Lamanu Misham, Shemisha Enu Yachol Lilmod Potu. Let me just see the answer, and then we'll go back to the question. Ela Vadai Laman Yilameduhu. So this Rav Ashi's proof that we have to read it as Laman Yilamedu, that he cannot teach others. Why? Because if we're going to assume that Laman Yilmedu means that he should be capable of what? Of learning, is if he cannot speak, just one second, if he cannot speak, then what? Then Einu Yochel Lilmod Afli Atzmo. Varei Vadagam Hamidaber the Eino Shomeh, if he cannot hear, Kim Shavalo Goma. He cannot learn. So again, what's the kasha that Rav Ashi is asking? I'm sorry, I got stuck here. If you're going to tell me that you read it Laman Yilmedu, that he should be able to study, so then how are you excluding and why are you excluding the case of someone who cannot speak? And the answer is that Eino Yochel Lilmod Afli Atzmo. I'm not sure what the Gemara means now. Rav Ashi has in mind that if he cannot speak, we assume that that's an intellectual, that there's some sort of what's the word I want to use? Some sort of deficiency in his capability of intellect, in his intellect.
Is it saying? I think it's saying that Laman Yilmedu is teach.
I thought that was Laman Yilamedu. Rav Ashi is trying to prove that when it says Laman Yilmedu, you have to read it and vocalize it and punctuate it as Laman Yilamedu. Why? Because if you're going to read it as Laman Yilmedu, and Laman Yilmedu is coming to exclude the case of someone who cannot speak, and how does Laman Yilmedu exclude someone who cannot speak? I think we're assuming that if he cannot speak, then he's lakui, meaning he has a deficiency in learning. Then what about someone who cannot hear? Kevid lo shama lo gomar. He certainly is not capable of understanding if he cannot hear what's being said.
Right.
So it must be that the reason why the Torah excluded him from the mitzvah of Hakel is derived from the pasuk Laman Yishmu. Okay, fine. So Laman Yishmu, I understand very well, excludes someone who cannot understand because he cannot hear. So now we're ready for the punchline. What's the kasha of Rav Ashi? Hi, in the case of someone who doesn't speak, milaman yishmu nafka. If the psul is based on the fact that he cannot study, in the case where he's deaf, he doesn't hear what's going on, so you can't teach him, then that same pasuk laman yishmu should exclude a person who cannot speak, even though he can hear, because we're saying that if he cannot speak, then he doesn't have one of the critical elements in intelligence. So why did the Torah have to go ahead and add Laman Yilmadu? Let's learn both exclusions from the same pasuk Laman Yishmu, which means Yachal Lilmod, Laman Yishmu, so that they will learn. Elavadai, therefore, says Rav Ashi, the fact that we need another pasuk of Laman Yilmadu, what it means is that if somebody could hear but he doesn't speak, he can learn. We don't view his inability to speak as a deficiency in his understanding. He's mute, but he understands. And therefore, the Torah added the mute of Laman Yilamedu. And Laman Yilamedu is teaching me that he cannot transmit the Torah to others if he cannot speak, and therefore he's part. That's how I understood the Gemara. Omer of Rabbi Tanchu. Cheresh bi ozno achas potem min ha're'iyah. If he's deaf in one ear, he's exempt from re'iyah. Shenemar, we go back to the parsha in Hakel, and the Torah says, Tikras HaTorah zos neged kol Yisrael be'oznehem, in the plural. And that means that he can hear from both of his ears. But if he's deaf in one ear, he's exempt from the mitzvah of Hakel. And by virtue of the Gzeirah Shavah between Hakel and Re'iyah, he's likewise exempt from the mitzvah of Re'iyah. So the Gemara asks, Hi be'ozneim, you're using the word be'ozneim to exclude a deaf person in one ear. I need it for something else. Be'ozneim de kulu Yisrael. That the obligation of the Melech is to read the Torah in such a way that the entire community of Israel would be able to hear the reading of the Torah. So therefore, I need the word be'ozneim for simple pshat to teach me that the Melech has to project his voice in such a way that every single individual could hear. But it doesn't mean that the word ozneim is coming to exclude someone who's deaf in one ear. And the Gemara answers, who you want to derive the obligation to read into the ears of all of Israel. That I know from the pasuk, mi neged kol Yisrael nafka. It already says in the pasuk. Let's read the pasuk. It says, just 1 second. It says Tikras HaTorah zos neged kol Yisrael b'ozneim. So it says neged kol Yisrael. And the word ozneim, therefore, is superfluous, and we could derive the exclusion of a deaf person in one ear. So the Gemara asks, "Imi neged kol Yisrael." If I only had the pasuk mi neged kol Yisrael, Havamin, I would have thought that's enough that kol Yisrael is standing there. Mi neged kol Yisrael. In other words, he has to stand in a way that the whole community of Israel could see him. But afagav lo shami, they don't necessarily have to hear him, and therefore the Torah had to add the word be'ozneim, neged kol Yisrael be'ozneim, v'hu deshami, that they all have to hear what he says. And once again, we're back to square one. We don't have an extra pasuk be'ozneim to exclude someone who's deaf in one ear. And the Gemara answers, who the requirement that everyone should be able to hear mi laman yishmu nafka. We could derive that from the pasuk that says Hakel asa'am laman yishmu, and therefore the word be'ozneim is superfluous. And from the redundant word be'ozneim, we exclude someone who's deaf in one ear. Rabbi Tanchum, furthermore, chiger beraglo achas, if he's lame in one of his legs, potem min ha're'iyah shenemar. The Torah says with regard to the mitzvah of regel, shalosh regolim, tachog li bashon, and the word regolim is in the plural, and that indicates that he has two functioning legs. So the Gemara asks for her regolim iboile. I need that pasuk shalosh regolim for another exclusion. It's not redundant. Prat lebale kabin, to exclude those amputees who have a fake leg, a prosthetic leg, and what they do is they place their thigh from the thigh and down into some sort of a leg, which they can step on and they could walk with it. And they're potter from Re'iyah. So here we're talking about a case of a person who doesn't have legs at all. And he's excluded under the pasuk regalim. But I don't have the ability now to exclude a person who's lame in one leg from the word regalim. So Gemara says, who that law, that exemption in the case of Bali Kabin, I derive from the pasuk Pe'amim. It says Shalosh Pa'amim Ashana Yeira Kol Zkurcha. And the word Pa'amim, as we're going to see later on, means Raglayim. And Pa'amim means he has two legs. But Bali Regalim, or Bali Reglayim, they're chayiv in the mitzvah, but not those who have the ability to walk in with one leg. For that, I need the exclusion of regalim. And when it says shalosh pa'amim, I have an exemption for someone who's a bale kabin. Tisanya, we learned in the Brisa, it says in the pasuk shalosh pa'amim bashana, ein pa'amim ela raglayim. How do we know the word pa'amim means raglayim? And only someone who has raglayim is obligated in the mitzvah re'iyah. We know it from a pasuk in Yeshayahu Hanavi. V'cheinu omer, with regard to the lands of the Goyim at the time of the ultimate redemption, it says Tirmusena regel ragle ani pame dalim, that the enemies of the Jewish people will stomp upon the people of Israel with their legs, and it says pame dalim. So the word pamim, or pame is just if it's besmichus, but the real noun is pamim, is referring to regalim, to regel ragle ani. The Omer, another pasuk in Shir Hashirim, Mayafu pamayich bana olim bas nadiv. Here again, the pasuk is talking about raglayim, and it used the word pamayich, because nalayim can only be worn by people who have legs. So pamayich bin olim means your legs in the shoes. So the word pa'amim means not raglayim, and therefore comes to exclude bali kabin. And then in addition to the word pa'amim, where it says shalosh pa'amim, we have the extra word ragalim, shalosh regalim tachaguli bashana, and the word regalim is now coming to exclude someone who is lame in one leg. The way I understand this Gemara, and tell me if you agree with me, is that if someone has fake legs, you might have thought he's even better than someone who has one leg, because he can somehow propel himself with locution on two prosthetic legs. So maybe he's better off than someone who's lame in one leg. So we have two different drashos. One mute to exclude bali kabin, and another one to exclude chiger beregel achas. Darash Rava, my dechsiv. What does the pasuk in Shir Shir mean? My yafu pamayich bin olim bas nediv. This is a bit of an agadita. Kamanoim ragleim shal Yisrael b'shasha olim l'regel. So the word pa'amim, pa'amayich, refers to raglayim. How beautiful are the legs of Bnei Yisrael when they climb up to Yerushalayim for the regel, for aliyah l'regel. And there's a special praise to the people of Israel for this mitzvah of aliyah l'regel. Now, why are Klal Yisrael called Bas Nediv? Bito shel Avram Avinu shenikra Nediv. Avram Avinu is called in Tehillim Nediv. And the people of Israel are Bas Nediv. We are the daughter of Avram Avinu. Bito shel Avram Avinu shenikra Nediv shenemar. Where do we see that Avram is called the Nediv? And this is a pasuk we remember from before the shofar blowing. Divei amim nesafu am elokei Avram ki elokim magine eretz. In other words, there are gerei tzedek, there are converts to Judaism that on their own volition, voluntarily, they took it upon themselves, even though they live amongst the nations of the world, the old mitzvos, the responsibility to fulfill the mitzvos, and liyosid level, they will gather together, they will see the power of God to protect those who rely and believe in God. And now we have to understand this pasuk, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is called Elokei Avraham. And why does it say Elokei Avraham? Nedivei Amim Nesafu Am Elokei Avraham. Why does the pasuk single out Elokei Avraham? V'lo Elokei Yitzchak v'Yaakov Elo Elokei Avraham Shayatchil L'Gerin. Because he was the one who brought these people, these Nedivei Am, who benedivus, on their own volition. They opted to accept the Torah mitzvahs. But we see that Avraham is called Nediv. And therefore the Klal Yisrael are called Bas Nediv, the daughter of Nediv. Rav Kahana Dorish Rav Nosson Bar Yomi Mishum Ravi Tanchu Mai Dichsiv. What do we do with the pasuk in Yosef HaTzadik? It says that when Yosef HaTzadik was thrust into a bar, the pasuk says, "Vabar reik ein bo mayim." The beginning of Vayeshev. The mashba shenevar vabar reik ein yodeh ein bo mayim. You told me it's empty. Ela mayim ein bo avol nechashim bakravim yesh bo. So there's another drasha in the name of Rabbi Tanchum, a very famous one. And once we mentioned the other drasha of Rabbi Tanchum, we throw in this one to the book. Now we derive from the parsha of Hakel the laws of Re'iyah. We learned in a brayso. Ma'aseh Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, Rabbi Lazar ben Chasma, shel holchu lahakil pnei Rabbi Yeshua b'Pekin. They wanted to be mekayim the mitzvah of lakabel pnei Rabbo b'regel. So to be mechabed, Rabbi Yeshua, the two of them went to Pekin. Amalehem, Rabbi Yeshua said, "Ma chidush hayu b'beis medrash hayom." What new insights into Torah did you create today? Amrulo, they said, "Talmidechanu." We can't speak in your presence. We're Talmidim. Mechanu chosim. We drink your waters. All of that Torah is coming from you. So we don't have anything that we could be mechadish that you don't know about. Whatever we know, we learn from you. Amalehem afal pichein yefshel lebeis hamedrash b'lo chidush. Nevertheless, even though you received the Torah from me, you must have been mechadish something new and some new insight in the Torah. Can you share it with me? But nevertheless, they were shy, I guess you'd say, or somewhat inhibited to say Torah and share chidushim with their Rebbe. So now Rabbi Yeshua asks them the following question: Shabbos shel mi hoisa? Right, there was a rotation between Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. One Shabbos was the Shabbos of Rabbi Gamliel, the next Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and it went on and on and on. So this past Shabbos, now the history, the background to this rotation system is very, very painful for us, because during the Nesius of Rabbi Gamliel, he hurt Rabbi Yoshua, I don't mean physically, and therefore the Chachamim removed Rabbi Gamliel from his Nesius, and they appointed as his replacement Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. But later on, there was a pius between Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Between Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua. And therefore, they wanted to bring Rabbi Gamliel back into his original status as the Nasi, but they had already appointed Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So they made this kind of pshara that each one would get his time. Rabbi Gamliel actually got 3 out of 4 Shabbosos. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah got 1. And that particular Shabbos, as Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar ben Chasma reported to Rabbi Yeshua, that Shabbos was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's Shabbos. So now Rabbi Yeshua says to his 2 Talmidim, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, Ubamer hoisa haggadah hayom. Meaning on that Shabbos, that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was serving as the chief transmitter of Torah. What Haggadah, what Torah teachings did he transmit? Amrulo, so they explained to Rabbi Yeshua that the Parshas Hakil, he was busy teaching the Parsha of Hakil, Umay Dorchba, and what new insights did he derive from the Parsha of Hakil? Hakil asa'am anoshim ataf, and then the pasuk says, L'man yishmu u'leman yilmedu. And the question is asked, Im anoshim ba'im lilmod, the men obviously come to study the Torah, noshim ba'os l'shmoa, and the women could at least hear the Torah. Maybe they don't understand it, they're not oriented, but taf, lama, ba'im. Why do we bring the young children? They don't understand the Torah. They don't even hear the Torah. But could they litain schar l'miviehem, to give reward to the parents who bring them. So the word taf here in this context is referring to very young children. In the case of ketanim of an older age, more mature, what we call a katan shegiya l'chinuch, they can actually hear the Torah and understand the Torah. But here we're talking about taf. Taf means very young infants. So if the taf don't understand anything, why is there a mitzvah to bring them? And the only possible solution to that is schar, to give reward to those who bring them. Now, if you recall, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah first asked the question, Anoshim boim lilmod v'noshim l'shmoa. And that's an introduction to the fact that taf are coming neither lilmod nor lishma, but rather lahavi litein schar l'miviyeh. Perhaps the Gemara was bothered. This is one interpretation in the Ein Yaakov, that the children will make noise and they'll interfere even with the Nashim who came lishma. So why do we bring these young children? I had to push you against the wall until I got you to agree to reveal this beautiful pearl of wisdom. And why don't you tell me this and share this with me up front from the beginning? The Dorash, now they tell him something else that they heard from Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Es Hashem hemarta hayom lios l'chol elokim. At the end of Sefer Dvarim, and then it says Vashem hemircha hayom lios lo liam sgula. So we want to understand what the word Marta means, and we're going to interpret Marta as a lashon of shvach, of praise. I'm going to praise you because you praise me as the one and only, as the singular, unique God, Echad Umiyuchad. That's called Chaticha Achas B'Olam. And because you declared that there's nothing like me, Ein Kamoni Ba'olam, therefore you have chosen to accept me as your God. Ani eschem chativa achas b'olam. I will praise you reciprocally with a praise that's very unique. And that is that there's no other nation on the face of the earth like you, and therefore I chose you to be my people. where do we find that God actually praised the people of Israel and said, and he declared, Atem asisuni chativa achas ba'olam, tichsiv, because the Jewish people declare Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. So we made God into chativa achas ba'olam, v'ani esa eschem chativa achas ba'olam. And Nemar, where do we find that God praised the people of Israel to make them a unique nation on the face of the earth and declare their greatness? And here you'll see the pasuk on the top of Daf Gimel Amud Beis, Umiki Amcha Yisrael Goyechad Ba'aretz. Who is like the people of Israel on the face of the earth? This is a pasuk in Divrei Yomi. And then the end of the pasuk says, Asher halach Elokim lifdotzlo am. HaKadosh Baruch Hu personally, v'chvodo v'atzmo, went to be podeh, to redeem the people of Israel from Mitzrayim, and to take them as his people. He did not do so with regard to any other nation. So this is a siman muvah, that the Jewish people are unique amongst all the nations of the world. And that's the shevach, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu praises the people of Israel as the unique people, just like we praise God as Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. God says, Mi Kamcha Yisrael, Goy Echad Ba'aretz. So here we have an idea from the Arizal, in which he says that the word Echad is equivalent to 13. Let's see if that works out. Ches is 8. Dalid is 8 and 4 is 12, and Aleph is 13. Now the Shem Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei, is 26. Let's see if that works out. Yud Hey is 15. Vav Hey is 11. 11 and 15 is 26. So there are two Echads here. There's one, Shema Yisrael Hashem Echad, and then there's the other is Mi Kiamcha Yisrael Goy Echad Bar. So the first Echad in Shema Yisrael is referring to God. And the second Echad here in Mi Kiamcha is referring to the people of Israel. So we have one Echad and another Echad. That means that the greatest Kedusha, the greatest holiness, is the Echad of Hashem's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei, and the Echad of Mi Kamcha Yisrael. They're mirror images.
Very nice.
Now, the Arizal points out that the last bracha before Kriyat Shema Shel Shachris ends with Habocher Bi'amu Yisrael Be'ava. So he takes the word Ava, and he's going to multiply it by 2. The base Be'ava means twice Ava. So if we take the word Ava, we have Aleph is 1, Hey makes it 6, Beis makes it 8, and Hey at the end of Ava is 8 plus 5 is 13. And you multiply 13 by 2, Beis Avos, and you get 26. So God chooses the Jewish people because they have 2 Avos. They have Ava for Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, and they have Ava for Mi Kiamcha Yisrael. And the Arizal says that when we recite that bracha, we should have in mind that as we're about to accept upon ourselves Avas Hashem, with Shema Yisrael, we should also accept upon ourselves Avas Yisrael, the love for every Jew, because God chooses us because of these 2 Avos, the 13 and the 13, the Echad and the Echad, the Kiamcha Yisrael Goy Echad, and the Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. All right, this is where we'll stop here on the top of Daf Gimel Amud Beis.
Okay, very nice. Go ahead.
I wish you a great day, a great week.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you so much.
Okay.